Alrighty, everyone, and welcome back to Refounding Democracy. We are very pleased to be back after travels, some of us through Ukraine and other places, and having a great series on situation in Ukraine and what's going on as the pressures of the war are working on society there. So now we're in a way coming back to the US, but also going up in a level of abstraction because we're going to be talking today about some concepts that are really important, but may not be, their importance may not be obvious. The What we're going to talk about today is the concept of autonomy. Now, this is the central concept in at the foundation of a secular liberal democracy. All of the democracies of the world that are true to the name really are grounded on this concept that human beings have the right, the duty, and the capacity, and should have the opportunity to, in a sense, make their own way in the world, decide what is best for them, and make their own choices and live with the consequences. This is, if you think about the authoritarian challenge to democracy around the world today, you can imagine that this is not what authoritarians are quite interested in at the moment. So we are, and today we're going to talk about a particular challenge to this concept that's coming from a group of Christian intellectuals. The impetus for this was the passing a week ago yesterday of Timothy Keller. By the way, in the original email, I miswrote his name as Heller. That was a typo, not a misunderstanding, but thanks to Peter for catching it. He was an interesting fellow in a lot of ways, a conservative Presbyterian minister who could have joined many others of his generation and founded a church out in the suburbs, a mega church where he would have lots of adherents who were, giving him money, and he would be founding other conservative evangelical churches in the era of Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority and the like. He took a different path. He founded a church in Manhattan, and he therefore was dealing directly with what you might call the emerging post-Christian majority of the United States, and gave a lot of thought in his rhetoric to how to talk to people who maybe they were lawyers, or maybe they were lapsed Christians, or maybe they weren't Christians at all, and he had to refine a language that would speak to them. And so he wrote a number of books. Is quite admired in some Christian circles. The Atlantic did a nice profile on him that I linked to and quoted from in the newsletter announcement for this video podcast. But what we're gonna focus on today is not his whole life and the controversies around it, but focus on this pointed critique and of the concept of personal autonomy as a high, or the highest good. This was a persistent criticism of his, and since it is so important. Essentially, when we're talking about this, although it's not obvious, we are really talking about the contest between secular liberal democracy and some other notion of how society should be put together. And that's based on some other conceptual foundations, and that's what. So the stakes it may appear that this conversation is dry and abstract, but the stakes are actually monumental. They're really about what kind of people, what kind of society we're going to make for ourselves. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're joined as always by So I should have introduced myself. I'm very lazy that way. So I'm Athena Small, the host of Refounding Democracy, joined as usual by our co-host Peter Lupu, who is the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Glendale Community College in Glendale, Arizona, and Pini Ben-Or, who's a philosopher and data scientist who lives in the Seattle area. And welcome back, you both. I see there arrives our assistant co-host, Argos. Thank goodness. So the whole hosting team is here. So, Peter, first, why don't you both say hi?
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Peter, you've talked a lot about this intellectual challenge. Why don't you tell us the concept of autonomy from Christian intellectual circles? Why don't you tell us a little more about this, what's going on intellectually, and then a little more about, we can all talk about why it matters.
So the story kind of begins really with the Enlightenment. And in some ways, it goes all the way back to the Greeks. But in the Enlightenment, the concept of autonomy became central to the sort of general conception of human beings. And the understanding of autonomy, for example, by Immanuel Kant and sort of others, is that individuals have what you might call a property of self-determination and self-governance in all spheres. And it is this conception in certain ways that found its way to Western culture. The questions of what self-determination means and self-governance means are important, central to understanding, number one, what was the intellectual legacy of the Enlightenment, or at least one central important tenet of it. And also the debate that has been going on actually for some time now, but it has become even more heated in the last several decades, that the critique of the Enlightenment included, and the critique of the Enlightenment was going on right after the Enlightenment, but also in more recent times from different directions. And the Enlightenment was criticized in many different ways and many different components of it. But one of the critiques that comes that is relevant to our current discussion is the critique of the concept of autonomy from the emerging Christian intellectuals like Timothy Keller, and an attempt to replace autonomy in the architecture of our understanding of ourselves with the concept of dignity. One of the critiques from this perspective and others of the concept of autonomy is that throughout the centuries, the time since the Enlightenment, the concept of autonomy has been reduced to basically individual desires and wants and motives. So autonomy means, so for example, very frequently people talk about freedom as connected very, very intimately with autonomy. And what does that freedom means? It basically to do whatever one wants. which of course is not the concept of self-determination and autonomy in the Enlightenment sense.
Okay, there's a lot of ground to cover here. So let's start with. So you said this concept found its most crystalline expression with Immanuel Kant. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah,
Okay.
Immanuel Kant had a very, very general concept of autonomy in his various different writings. But others in the Enlightenment have been promoting autonomy in different spheres.
Okay,
For
so
example, autonomy in science was considered to be the idea that it is up to human beings to engage in the study of nature without being coerced into dogmas, prior dogmas.
yeah, so for example, famously Galileo facing off against Vatican authorities with his observations on his telescope. That's what I saw.
Yeah.
And if it violates something in a book or in your dogmas, or that's I don't know what to tell you. This is what it is.
Yeah.
So can you help us? Maybe both of you, Pini, do you have? Maybe help us, or both of you, set the stage. What was before that? What was
I want to make a quick comment about
okay?
just before Kant. The importance of Spinoza in this picture was one of the early Enlightenment philosophers who recognized that the problem of freedom of choice and the problem of the self, what does it mean for an individual to be self-determined? He realized this is a very important problem in the history of the philosophy of religion, and he proposed a solution for it that's very elaborate. And the idea of freedom of thought and freedom of choice is very critical to his philosophy, and this is before Kant. Some people think that he influenced Kant greatly. I guess that's debatable, but he certainly expressed these ideas before Kant.
Okay, so how is this revolutionary or important? What was the big deal? What were people saying?
Okay, so let me make a comment, just a comment about that. Maybe that will help set the stage. At least my view is that the importance here, and this is also Spinoza, is turning this idea into a political principle, a requirement about politics, a requirement about a moral requirement, you may argue, about how society should be organized and how politics should work. And the requirement is that high respect for individual autonomy should be paid by any social organization and institution and society as a whole and the polity as a whole. High respect for individual autonomy. Turning this idea of autonomy as primarily a fact about human beings, about their faculties, and secondarily a moral requirement, but turning the moral requirement into a political requirement. I think that's a major revolution and maybe the beginning of the Enlightenment, and that's Spinoza.
So let's put some dates on this. When is Spinoza writing, articulating these ideas?
1660s.
And that's and he's in Amsterdam.
Yep.
And so this is around the same time as Isaac Newton is developing his theories of universal gravitation. And it's around the same time that, maybe just a little before, John Locke is writing his second treatise on government, which is also embracing the idea that that humans are endowed with rights, and that is the foundation of a legitimate political order. And then Hobbes is When is he? 1650s or anybody know? Roundabout. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just say one thing, since Pini mentioned this. It's very important to understand that the connection between in the Enlightenment framework between autonomy and authority. And the way to understand it is this: the conception is a very influential historically conception that an authoritative hierarchy among humans, innate generally, but among humans, is baked into nature. And therefore, the way Pini mentioned, the way to organize society, the optimal organization of a society must follow this authoritative hierarchy that is baked into our nature. This has been a very entrenched conception. The Enlightenment undermined this conception. By the way, the authoritative hierarchy conception, obviously, one should understand, is very much entrenched and is part of the foundation of the Judeo-Christian conception.
Well, let's take a little more time on that. So
yeah, I just want to say that the Enlightenment challenged this authoritative hierarchical arrangement and tried to lay the foundation for a more egalitarian society in which autonomy plays a central role, and all authority must be derived from autonomous decisions. So that's what I wanted to add.
So let's say we're in the 1400s. These concepts are not on anybody. Maybe they were talking about them a little bit in the Greeks, but right now, and maybe there's, I don't know, maybe a few people are reading Aristotle, but really this isn't on anybody's kind of radar screen, these ideas. Is that fair?
Generally, not. Yeah.
And you've got a if you had an image of the way the world is, the way it actually is, it would look like a pyramid. There's God at the top. There's God's anointed representative on earth, the king, or the and then everybody else has their place in society within this hierarchy, and God wants it this way. God set it up this way. That's the picture that everybody's got in their mind, and
it's very important to emphasize that authority in this hierarchical picture implies submissiveness. Yep. Each layer below that higher level has to be submissive to the higher level.
Right, and then if you don't, you're breaking the rules. But you're doing something worse. You're really upsetting the social order. You're defying God and God's will. You're really your proper place in this whole picture is to submit to the authority, because ultimately it all comes from God.
Right.
That's
God's ultimate sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
Which sovereignty is the idea that God controls everything and is the source of everything. God's ultimate sovereignty and therefore authority is channeled through this hierarchy. And at each level, there is a totally different roles associated. Yeah. So I just wanted to inject here something, and I know, Athena, you want to go back to something else, but it's very important because we're talking about, or in part, we're talking about Timothy Keller. And Timothy Keller was a very important champion of what is called Christian complementariness, which suggests that the role of women and men is complementary, but the hierarchical nature is that women have to be submissive to men. This comes from the following passage in Timothy.
In Keller's, Timothy Keller's.
Timothy 1.
Oh, so you're talking Timothy, not Timothy Keller, but the biblical New Testament Christian Bible letter of St. Paul.
Paul to Carnadians, I think it was, or something like that.
No, Timothy is a different letter. Anyway, so yeah, there's Corinthians and Timothy. Go on. So we're in the Christian Bible, right?
And this complementariness doctrine that has been very influential in the last several decades comes from this. A woman must learn in quietness and full submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over men. She is to remain quiet, for Adam was formed first and then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman who was deceived and fell into transgression. Women, however, will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. End of quote.
Woo.
Athena, don't you love this?
Oh, I find free will to be such a burden, I must say.
It is a burden. Yeah. And of course, Timothy Keller will tell you that you don't even have free will.
No, and I don't have free will, and the illusion of free will actually just brings me all kinds of pain and unhappiness.
Yeah.
Okay, joking aside, can I make a couple of comments?
Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
So I think Peter is absolutely right to link this issue about hierarchy to the issue of autonomy. One way to put this question or debate or contrast philosophically is in terms of what's fundamental and what's derivative. And there are a number of questions about what's fundamental versus what's derivative. One of them is the hierarchy fundamental or derivative versus the autonomy? And autonomy itself, you can say, and I think this is one of Keller's arguments, is that autonomy has conditions. He did not deny autonomy completely, certainly not completely, and I would say that he, in some sense, has a high regard for autonomy. But I think his main criticism, maybe we'll get to that later, is about some preconditions. And this criticism is not just in Christian doctrine. There is a broader criticism of liberalism and autonomy in the history of political philosophy, even the modern history, which is similar. And that is, there are some conditions, and autonomy in some sense is not fundamental. But let's start with the hierarchy. I want to make that point. So the idea that hierarchy is fundamental is what Peter was emphasizing. And autonomy, in some sense, is derivative versus the opposite. So I think part of the idea of enlightenment, and remember, the enlightenment came into a world in which there are many hierarchies. It's not only men and women, right? There are many, many hierarchies. Peasants could not challenge their lords, and so on and so forth. Very broad phenomena. Anyone, people with certain professions had to stay in that profession and had to obey the laws of the guilds and so on. And you could not deviate from that. If you became a baker, then you're a baker, and that's it. You are part of a hierarchy. You're a servant, and that's it. So the question now is, what's fundamental, autonomy or hierarchy? And the view of the new liberals, of the initiators of the Enlightenment conception, was that autonomy is more fundamental. It's a fundamental fact that, according to the Enlightenment, the fundamental fact that all people have more or less equal capacities to make free choices, to reason, to choose their values, not only actions, but choose their values and choose a path in life. They have equal capacities. That's almost an empirical question, an empirical statement about human faculties. So that's one. And also the moral side of it, which is it's a good thing for humans to develop their autonomy and develop their lives as individuals. And therefore, it's a constraint on society. And if you ask about hierarchy, hierarchy is derivative. Of course, there is a fact of hierarchy. There are many hierarchies in societies, but they are the results of social institutions that are in many ways accidental. Autonomy is fundamental. Hierarchy is accidental and derivative.
Or designed. It could be accidental. It could be designed. It could be entered. You could enter into a hierarchical relationship freely. Like, when I was a graduate student, I entered into a hierarchical relationship with my advisor. I actually didn't like being a subordinate. It goes against my personality.
And with me.
What? No, and yeah, that was. That's one I've never shaken off. Is my hierarchical relationship with Peter, as we can see. But so if you can, I'm just really doubling down on your claim that if you begin with autonomy, hierarchies can emerge through various reasons and mechanisms because people either for economic constraints or free choice or so on, but hierarchy is not fundamental. It's something that humans effectively create.
It's conventional. It's an
historical. Well, the convention is also derivative. My view would be that it's a historical accident. People collect power historically in one way or another. Some people collect power, and then they exercise this power and collect more power and so on. And there are various kinds of powers that people can collect and have collected, and they tend to entrench these powers over time from one generation to the next. They turn into conventions, but that's an historical accident. It's not a fundamental fact about nature, and it's not a fundamental moral fact, according to the Enlightenment.
Right. But what Adina was talking about is the idea that the hierarchy, that there are hierarchies, but they are created in society. They're hierarchies, but they're created as conventional mechanisms to organize certain things, but they are temporary.
They're certainly not God-given. I mean, look, there's actually Nobel Prizes in economics given for research into industrial organization. How do you organize production and trade? And one that depending on the nature of what you are trying to organize, the activity you're trying to organize, it may make sense to organize things in a very decentralized way, where people, interact kind of as molecules in a bath and trade, or it can make sense to organize things in a hierarchy. You cannot really run U.S. Steel or Intel as a bunch of decentralized agents contracting with each other however they individually choose. It does not work. You can't run the United States government executive branch as a decentralized bunch of atoms transacting with each other. You have to have hierarchies to be. It is the more efficient form of organization for certain kinds of production processes, so you can decide quite rationally to enter into hierarchical.
Yeah, but Atina, you are right. But and I return to Pini in a moment. But you're right about that for certain instrumental purposes, the organization that is optimal has a hierarchical structure. Mm-hmm. That's your point.
Yes.
The thing is, though, that who is plugged into that each place in the hierarchy is not based on some natural,
correct,
baked-in thing. so this is a conditional on certain instrumental goals. This is how you build it. And then you plug in people in there based on merit or whatever other expertise and so forth. In the case of the United States government, you mentioned the executive, that is temporary. That's what I meant. That the hierarchy is who plays the role is temporary. It's not.
Right. Roles are separable from individuals.
Yes,
roles
exactly.
are separable from personalities and birth.
Right.
Right.
Whereas in the case of the hierarchical structure conception, those are baked in.
Yeah.
So whatever is whoever has is baked in, that's forever. That they cannot move around, more or less. Now, what Pini was suggesting is the historical coincidence or contingency, where it so happens that certain people obtain a position in hierarchy, for example, by accumulating certain instruments of power, let's say wealth.
Or inheriting.
And then inheriting it, and then that wealth is concentrated, and that may affect other conventional hierarchies. And so while not baked in nature, as the other conception says, it can be functionally almost identical.
Yeah.
Is that was Pini? That was your point?
More or less, yes.
So take one, for example, like let's say your father was a successful real estate developer in Queens and made a bunch of money, and then you were able to...
I have no idea who you're talking about.
Yeah, never mind. It's just a very hypothetical situation I'm talking about.
But it's very important to see the relationship between the Enlightenment conception versus the other conception that Pini mentioned about fundamental and derivative. In the Enlightenment conception, generally authority is derived from autonomy.
Right. Of ultimately, you as a human being who are autonomous, you choose, maybe subject to constraints, maybe under duress even, but at some level you have the capacity and legitimate authority to choose what kinds of authorities you will accept onto you.
Right, and therefore authority is temporary and sort of passive.
Right, and I think it's also important to highlight this point I made a moment ago, that authorities are separable from individual identities.
Individuals, yes. Pini's point earlier is very important. The critique of autonomy that he mentioned from different areas is reversing this thing. Is authority is fundamental and constrains autonomy. So when Pini earlier was talking about the thing to say the critique of autonomy is that autonomy has to be under certain constraints. But it's important to mention what constraints. For example, according to the hierarchical picture, authority constrains autonomy. On the Enlightenment picture, reason constrains autonomy. And reason is independent from any authority. It has its own authoritative force, as it were. Sorry.
Is that?
So yeah, I'd like to comment on that. I view this a little differently, but fundamentally, I think I agree with you, except I would not use the word constraint here. But again, I would ask, what's more fundamental, autonomy or something else? So the modern critique of autonomy, Keller's, and not only Keller's, as I'll try to show, starts with the idea that freedom is illusory, which is, you alluded to. And I have to say that I'm very sympathetic to that, in some sense. We have to remember, Keller operated in the late 20th, early 21st century. in a context, in a social context, where we have a democracy, liberal democracy, more or less. Certainly, you can argue in Manhattan, but this is a context where a lot of what's going on around us is shaped by a neoliberal economy, a set of institutions around capitalism, a lot of advertising, a lot of materialism. And in that context, the argument that freedom is illusory, that we don't really choose our values are chosen for us by advertising and so on, and materialist choices are not real freedom. That's the context in which he made that argument. And I'm very sympathetic to it, and not only I think there is a lot of liberals and Marxists and social democrats that have similar arguments, that to some extent, empirically, what people perceive as a freedom, the freedom to buy this kind of butter versus that kind of butter in the store, it's not fundamental, it's illusory. So one part of that criticism is a criticism of the empirical side of freedom. You think you're free, but please pay attention to the forces that influence your choices that are external to you. That criticism is very valid, and it clearly spoke to many young people from various backgrounds, not just religious backgrounds, who had discontent. And today, still many have discontent in a society that is so materialistic and so on. But there is a more fundamental, I would say, criticism here, which is that autonomy, any kind of autonomy, has preconditions. You cannot be autonomous without being a person first. And to be a person, you have to be aware of the context of values in which you live. And these values are community values. You have to be part of a community to have autonomy. That's the argument. And therefore, community and community values are more fundamental than autonomy. That argument, I think, Keller expresses, and that's only an argument that we've heard about in the history of modern political philosophy, that personhood requires being in a community and requires adopting certain values in some sense from the outside. So I think that is the fundamental criticism of autonomy, the most important one to deal with, that may create the biggest challenge to liberal democracy. And again, Keller is not alone in this argument. The real paradox about Keller's views is that, okay, you can believe that, but what happens if your community is a Christian community? You are, and what's your attitude toward the values of that community? You adopt values, you adopt beliefs with some level of critical thinking, but how much critical thinking? So Keller was recommending, obviously, Christian set of values, Christian community as an alternative. And where does autonomy fit with that? We have to ask this question. Even if it's true that to be a person, you have to have values, and these values have to come from somewhere. There is some precondition for autonomy. Even if that's true, what about the reason? What about critical oversight or critical review, or using your critical reasoning to challenge those values? That, I think, is the critical question. If that is suppressed by authoritarian structure, like a set of religious values that cannot be challenged, that's the paradox. The paradox is that he expressed a criticism of autonomy that is at least somewhat legitimate, or two criticism at least, but how do you make that consistent with the idea of adopting a set of religious values? That's the challenge to Keller, I think.
Okay, this is great. I want to pause and step back and just note, if you are in 21st century U.S. or the West, a lot of this sounds not certainly not all of it, but a lot of it sounds pretty reasonable. Maybe some of it even obvious. Like, of course I have autonomy. What are you talking about? How how revolutionary was this? And how did we, a little more, I want to just go very quickly through some centuries, because if you're in the 1400s, none of this makes much sense at all. The air you breathe is giving you messages about hierarchy and your place in the world. Your identity comes from God, and you're born into a certain place in this structure, and that's your identity and your relationship to authority, both up and down, is fixed. How did we get to where we are now? I think to me,
very slowly,
very slowly is part of the answer. I think a first earthquake has to be the Protestant Reformation in Martin Luther.
There are three earthquakes.
And
they're all related. Yes,
okay.
all of them are related and based on the same thing. So your question is, how revolutionary this was? Very, extremely revolutionary, because if you just look at one of the earthquakes, what are the three earthquakes? One is the Protestant Reformation, the other one was the scientific revolution, and the other one was the political revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Political revolution, which one?
Social contract theory.
Social contract theory. The political.
Okay, I have to say something about this. What about the Renaissance? The Renaissance in Italy.
Yes,
okay.
The Renaissance was before the Enlightenment.
So that's really
led into.
But I think it's a fundamental. Represents a fundamental change, social change, and a change in conceptions about life and individuals. It is really I think the most important precursor of enlightenment.
Exactly, and part of the reason why the Renaissance was so important in setting setting the groundwork for the Enlightenment is because even within the Christian circles, there was a shift in allowing the secular works of the Greeks and others, Romans and others, to be read and to be acknowledged, and of course to be at some point fitted within the Christian orthodoxy, but it was permitted. And it was actually in the social hierarchies in Europe at the time, the social, not hierarchies, but the social salons and all that. It was actually a great thing if you could quote from Cicero, for example, or from Aristotle, or from whatever. So that allowing the ideas of the secular, outside of the theistic writings, to be introduced, I think set the stage for the Enlightenment. And I agree with that 100%. It's a very complicated relationship, of course, but what I wanted to emphasize
I want to note about you can see this in the art in the Renaissance, how you shift from pictures of the saints and Jesus and you're going to hell and you're going to burn, to a focus on individual human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And the paintings of individual Medici lords, and you Leonardo with his famous the picture of the I forget what that piece is called. Please help me, somebody that
human,
the naked guy in the circle with the pentagram,
which represents the idea that a human person is the measure of the universe.
Mm-hmm. Which is absolutely revolutionary. And then thinking to what Pini, you said a minute ago, that you have to be a person before you can have autonomy. The Renaissance created not created, but in a way reminded us in the West of individual personhood and the importance of the individual.
Right.
Before, that was a precursor to any discussion of legitimate authority or and arrangements of people.
Right. I should put a pin in. Do we have pins?
I thought you were supposed to order more pins, Peter. We spent weeks in Ukraine. You had one job.
I forgot. I'm sorry. I want to put a pretend pin in what Pini says. I disagree with quite a bit of what Pini says about Timothy Keller and his critique. Although I agree that it is a sort of like a critique that is circulating, but I disagree as to the cogency and validity of the critique, because I think it's in large part attacking a straw man.
I missed an opportunity here because
you did.
I did because there was I was gonna say after Pini got done with his sympathetic review of Keller, you are right, and then I could say to you, Peter, you are right.
You are right.
And then Pini could say, you cannot both be right. And I would say, you are right.
Yeah.
And this is from...
Where is that coming from?
Fiddler on the Roof.
Fiddler on the Roof, of course.
Yeah, this is Tevye talking with, kibitzing with all the folks he's selling milk to.
Yeah. Yes, you did.
Yes. So So we got the Renaissance, who reminding us of the humanity. Man is the measure of all things. Usually it was men in that context, but okay. And then can we move to the next earthquake? The Protestant, Luther pounds his, I think it's 95 theses, right, on the doors of the Wittenberg Cathedral, setting off the Protestant Reformation, and because he's now challenging the biggest hierarchy of all, the Catholic Church, and changing the relationship of the human to God, granting individual...
That's about authority.
What?
Who has authority over the relationship between each individual and God? The Catholic Church says, I do.
And
Luther said, no.
Each individual has authority, legitimate authority in this, the most important relationship of their life and their world.
Right. Legitimate access to a relationship with God, whereas the Catholic Church says that access has to be mediated to
through us.
Yeah. But all three earthquakes of the Enlightenment had exactly the same feature, which is shifting from centralized authority to something else. And for example, in the social contract revolution, that was a revolution in a political arrangement.
What's Wittenberg Cathedral, that's 1517. Scientific revolution happens throughout the 1500s and into the 1600s, and the social contract theory is coming starting around the 1640s.
50s. And the idea is that in the prior arrangement, you had the hierarchy. So the kings had absolute authority derived from divine right, presumably some sort of lineage to Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody else were positioned in different nobility hierarchies all the way to the common peasants and so forth. That was the arrangement, and it was a more or less arrangement throughout most of the world. What was the alternative? Chaos.
Mm-hmm.
That was the alternative. And almost in all, particularly in European societies, all people experience chaos because the transition of power in this scheme very frequently leads to civil war.
Right. Either you respect the and you gave a really important and reminded us of a central feature of this inheritance, birth.
Yeah.
Everything derives through a chain of genetics.
Yeah.
I didn't call it that. Rather than any kind of design any kind of functionality based on our reason of how we would like these individuals to play different roles, based on our understanding of their
Right.
competence or capacities or anything else that we have in mind. So
Right.
being able to you could thinking about this abstractly. You can say, in a way, we shift from a reliance on hardware to a reliance on software.
Right.
That is,
Yeah. Right.
let me articulate that.
Yeah.
That rather than saying you have this hardware and that defines your role, you're built this way, so you play this role in this overall structure. It's saying you have your capacities. We can rearrange structures in different ways, and you can move you from one over here to over there. Much looser notion of how you put anything together.
Right.
And creates all kinds of new
possibilities. But here is the thing. The problem was that the only alternative to the hardware, hard baked in hierarchical system was chaos. And many people experienced chaos when the transition of power was challenged. And two different families claimed divine authority. So you had war, civil war. Nobody wanted chaos. So the intellectual thinking was, you don't want chaos, that's your only alternative. The social contract theory says, no, there is a third alternative. And once that third alternative was offered and sufficiently internalized, the whole political world changed. And that alternative was that all power is derived from the autonomous consents of those who are ruled. That changed everything.
Right.
The same with
But to have that, have that set of concepts become possible, you had to first invent the individual, invent the notion of that you have will in your relationship to God, your freedom in you don't need a hierarchy in your relationship to God. You have the power to observe. All these things had to happen before you could imagine a political order using such.
Imagine, but certainly implement. And luckily, other elements started to emerge roughly around the same time, including the printing press, including the schools. So people were allowed to read, due to Luther, for example, the Bible. So it was translated into many languages, and it became available for much cheaper, so more people can have it, and therefore other books as well.
I still think big mistake. I don't know why they stopped burning people at the stake for translating the Bible. All kinds of problems.
They'll bring it back.
Good.
Don't worry.
Okay. Things are just a little unsettled now is all.
Are you familiar with the state in the United States called Florida?
It's the one that sticks out like a penis?
It sticks out as something, but And there they, banning books and poems and all that.
Good.
And eventually they will get to what you
any book that has sex in it, right, is got to be banned. So that would include the Bible.
No. The Bible has an exception, divine exception.
Okay. I didn't know.
Yeah. So I wanna just say, it is burning me. Finney's sympathetic. Sympathetic.
Okay. Let me just quickly bridge before we jump to that. So there's, let's say, folks who never bought this revolution. They're basically, I would say, still pre-moderns. They believe that effectively all of this has been a mistake. It's taken us away from God. And there's far too much ground to cover in a few seconds, but there is this counter tradition throughout, and I think if I would like to know if you think it's fair to place Keller and Charles Taylor and some of these current Christian thinkers in that counter tradition that argues that this, as Pini was saying, this notion of autonomy and free will is an illusion. And one, it's an illusion, and two, it doesn't actually deliver what it claims to deliver, which is human flourishing.
Yes, but I need to warn. I need a warning here. Put a pin on the warning. It is a mistake to think that this counter-enlightenment movement is situated only within Christian or religious context.
Mm-hmm.
And they have allies, and I don't want to say that these allies are intentional allies. They didn't align with them, but the embrace of hierarchical structure was also the very foundation of the fascist movement in Europe in the early 20th century.
And of course the foundation of white supremacy.
Yes,
right.
But the fascist movement, with like Genoa in France and Evola in Italy, they had, particularly Genoa, had a very general philosophical, deep resentment and objection to the social arrangement resulted in the Enlightenment legacy. And their alternative was back to the hierarchical thing, which did not, in fact, Genoa was very much anti-Christian, radically anti-Christian. So it's very important to understand that the broad, a broad conceptual framework is the hierarchical thing in which Christianity is situated as one of the ideologies.
Right. And since we just got back from Ukraine, we should mention that what is this, the fight, the war, the Russian assault on Ukraine, the Russo-Ukrainian war underway right now, is the hot war expression of this very intellectual conflict. That what Putinism is essentially warmed over Tsarism, which is this hierarchical conception that the Tsar and the Archpatriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church are both God's representatives on earth, in charge of the temporal and the profane and the sacred realm, respectively, and they are, and that's the only appropriate way to organize the world. And that Ukraine was violating God's chosen destiny for the Slavic people. Blah 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 blah.
Right. So I wanna get to the criticism of sympathetic thing to Timothy Keller. I have no sympathy to Timothy Keller, and the reason is this, and to this objection, because the fact that we are influenced by society, nobody in the Enlightenment or those who are promoting autonomy ever thought that we are not living in a community, in a society, and we are not influenced by it in various different ways. Whoever thought that? Nobody ever said that. The idea of autonomy is not that we are not influenced. The idea of autonomy is that we are in control. We can be, let me rephrase, we can be in control of those influences by adopting rational scrutiny of them. So yes, I am born in a particular community. I adopt the values, the preferences spread in that community. I am affected by commercials, by a materialist worldview, and so forth. whatever, society. But I can use my rational faculties to scrutinize any of those things. That is what autonomy is about.
Okay, so this is great. I'd love to comment about that and expand the point, because I think what you're saying is really at the core of the resolution of this debate. But before, I want to make a quick comment. Maybe we'll want to expand on that, and that's the relationship between all this debate, autonomy versus hierarchy, let's say, and the whole issue about religious ideology. So my comment here, and again, I don't want to expand on it now, but my comment here is that these two things are really at right angles. If you look at the history of religious ideologies, and even within Christianity, there is a great variety. And even within the world of Christianity, there are traditions that have a lot more respect for individual autonomy and a lot less respect for hierarchy. And if you look at the current phenomena in the US, the rise of the new, let's say, religious conservatism, paradoxically, is more on the Protestant side and not on the Catholic side. If you look at the Catholics, there is a great diversity within Catholics in terms of the level of progressivity and respect for autonomy and equality.
On the Protestant side as well. Let's be
Excuse
fair.
me?
On the Protestant side as well.
On the Protestant side as well. No, this is what I said a minute ago.
Okay.
Within the Protestant side. It's just interesting that the rise of the new, I'm pointing that out, the rise of the new conservatism is more on the Protestant side, which is, like Peter suggested, it kind of violates the basic idea of the Protestant Revolution, which is the capacity and the right of individuals to form their relationship with God as individuals, rather than mediated through some authoritative hierarchy. But really, this debate is at right angles with the philosophy of religion. And we can come back later and talk about that and talk about how Keller fits. But I think Peter is right. The fundamental question is about the nature of autonomy. So I want to emphasize and maybe expand a little bit on what Peter said. This idea that there is a fundamental contrast or dichotomy between what's more fundamental, autonomy or, let's say, community. This is a false dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
This is the important thing. It's a false dichotomy. Even if you grant that to be a person, before we can talk about autonomy, to be a person, you have to have values. You have to have some value structure, and it comes more or less from a community, even if it's the family. Even if you grant that, that's not the end of the story. Autonomy is not about how do you get your initial values. It's about how you are in charge of your values.
Right.
How you're in charge of your life, and how you use your reason, your capacity for reason, and as well as your capacity to communicate with others. How do you use those capacities in managing your life and evolving as a person, including evolving as a member of a community.
Right.
So it's the dynamics of values and beliefs. It's the dynamicism of values and beliefs where autonomy becomes more critical. And I think that's part of your point, Peter, and I think that's very important. It helps resolve this conflict, ideological conflict, which happened in the 20th century, political philosophy between liberalism and communitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the solution is that autonomy and respect, the demand for high respect for individual autonomy in society and social structure, that demand is based on the dynamicism of values and the capacity to use reason controlling or managing your life and evolving as an individual, and the importance of that in flourishing and happiness. And anyone who has kids knows that you have to instill some values in the kids, but you have to respect their freedom and autonomy if you want them to be happy. I think that's the core, philosophical core of this debate, is the misplacement or the setting that makes it like a dichotomy, a contrast between two different things, completely different things that are fundamental. Autonomy versus, let's say, community with its values. Once you resolve, when you see that it's a false dilemma, there is a solution. There is a solution that respects community and respects community values, but also respects maybe to a higher degree individual autonomy. So that's just an aberration, I think, of what Peter was saying. Now, I don't know if you guys want to get into the other aspect of Keller's position, which is proposing that some version of, I would say, conservative Christianity is the solution, is the basis for happiness.
Let's come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
I'd like to try a restatement of what I heard you just say, and see if you find it either acceptable or at least interesting, which is that a resolution of this so-called dichotomy or dilemma comes from a recognition of the difference between childhood and mature adulthood. That as a child, or a younger person, you have less capacity, not no capacity, but you may have less capacity to be fully reflective about how community has shaped you, how you want to shape yourself, and as a mature adult, you gain more and more of that capacity, and that what we mean by autonomy and the respect we give to the autonomy of individuals is a respect that of a capacity that is not distinctive of mature adults, but more embodied in mature adults. And that as a mature adult, we are both, we have roles, one of passing on our values to our kids and training them in the capacities to become mature adults, and at the same time reflecting on the values we've derived, the values we've inherited, and making choices that actually are in our, let's call it enlightened self, best interest, and that the alternative that is, and that you might say Keller's critique, or this current Christian intellectual critique, is essentially based on a kind of, maybe it's a straw man or it's a bait and switch. It's treating all humans as essentially children. They absorb what they learn from their community. They absorb what they learn from their environment. It doesn't, and it's true, but it's denying that mature adults are able to do better than that, and it's claiming, therefore, and if you say, okay, then what, which is like the next thing, what do you even if you granted that people are absorbing values from the community, what do you do about that politically? What do you do about that conceptually? And it sounds like Keller's answer is, well, good news, we've got conservative Christian thinking and Jesus, and these will take care of that for you, which is a, let's say a non sequitur. It does not follow. Is that are you comfortable with that characterization? Or
yeah, I'm totally comfortable.
Yeah.
Totally comfortable. But again, I want to elaborate just on one aspect of this.
Yes.
So what is it that we instill in kids when we instill values in them? There are two things, at least. One is specific values, specific ways to, specific principles, let's say, to value options in life.
Don't
By the
hit
way,
your
one of
sister
these,
because it's wrong, for example.
right. So there is a specific value, which is a specific way of looking at options for choices in life. And one of them, by the way, very important one, is the value of your community, the value of solidarity with other people in your community, and respect for other people in your community, and so on. So, but one thing we teach is the content of the values. Another thing we teach, which I just want to emphasize, it's just as important, is the idea of commitment and the experience of a commitment. The experience of a commitment is that a value is not just some feeling that could be momentary of enjoying being with the people in your community. It's a commitment. It's a requirement, or it's a demand on your resources and time. And this is the other thing we learn. And we have to learn what a commitment means by exercising specific values. But that does not mean that the content of the values that we learn and acquire has to be fixed. Moreover, the content of these values is very diverse. We learn to respect our community, but who is in our community? We learn to respect people. Maybe we also learn derivatively to respect all people from other communities. We come in touch with our communities, right? So why should we respect people in other communities, other kinds of people? When we grow, we realize that there are many values, and they're often in some form of conflict with each other. And now what? Who's going to decide how to resolve these conflicts? This is where autonomy comes in. We have to grow up and mature in such a way that we have the capacity to resolve our conflicts and make choices even when values and the world is very complex.
Yeah, and like you noted that our values, excuse me, can change. You could grow up in the value that homosexuality is perversion, and through long process of reflection, experience, etc., you come into a value conflict, and then you have a process of resolving that conflict that might lead to a change in your values. And part of what we're teaching them is, right, we start with don't hit your sister, specific values, but we're also training them in the capacity to work through that difficult process of resolving value conflict, of understanding your relation, your community. That's part of our job as adults, is training the next generation of adults to do that.
And also, by the way, how to control impulses and desires and wants and so forth.
Right.
But I wanted to mention here one thing.
Sorry, and on that's critical point there, which is so different from a picture that freedom just means do whatever you want, listen to your impulses. Right. No serious Enlightenment adherent buys that, fully hedonistic model. That we're just a bundle of impulses, and that you build a good society by everybody doing their own thing, exactly what they want all the time.
And by the way, Keller in part criticizes that very concept of as if autonomy would be doing whatever you want.
Yeah. In
many parts of his thing. But it's very important to think about the model. What is the model of the reconciliation, as Pinion pointed out, between individual autonomy and community? What is the model of what Athena was focusing on, of the process of raising a child, where the degrees of autonomy are minimal in the early stages and so forth, and then part of a responsible society, community, and family is to understand that what you want is to do two things at the same time. Is one, to instill values so that will guide behavior in a way that can be sort of complementary with other existence of other people in the community, but at the same time to instill the faculties required to reflect on those things and critically examine them. You want to do these two things, but depending on the stages. So I want to offer a model of the first, a model that I have to emphasize right away before Penny jumps in and takes off my head. That is just one such model of the dynamic resolution of what appears to be a conflict between individual autonomy and community, and that's Rawls' theory of justice.
So
it is precisely, it is precisely a model that attempts to resolve this conflict. The Rawls model is basically to say, what kind of principles should we essentially adopt in a liberal modern society, and what is the basis of adopting? And he offers us a model of how to do, what kind of principles, how to choose those principles.
Right. A model of the process.
What's the process and what they are.
Yeah.
And I emphasize again, it's one such model, and his purpose is to capture the essential element of a liberal society. And so he says that one of the ways, a process of adopting them is if you imagine yourself being behind the veil of ignorance. So you don't know specific facts about your actual existence, like whether you're male or female, rich or poor, what ethnicity and all that. You lack all that information. And now you ask what kind of principles, general principles. The role of those principles is actually regulative and guiding. These are not actual policies. They are regulative and guiding principles that regulate and guide what kind of policies should be adopted. Mm-hmm. So these are higher order.
Right. So think about how radical this looks from this picture looks again from the 15th century, 1400s earlier. The idea, okay, let's imagine that we're going to take you out of society, but you're still a person. We're going to take all of these people who don't have any roles, we don't know anything about them, but they're still people. This is like if you say this to someone in the year 1400, they say, "What are you talking about? There's
and
no
you better
such
not
thing."
You better not say it to the king.
And you better not say,
imagine
"Sure,
that you are not a king
you're
and
not,
rich and all that."
Right.
What?
But even if you're not a lord, you're not a baker, you're not you don't. There's the notion that you are a complete person without this role that you're born into. It doesn't even make sense. And the idea that then from this basis you could construct by design the kind of society you want. None of that makes any sense because God already did all that.
Right.
So
could somebody in that era could even imagine that? I mean, I'm assuming there had to be some.
It would take a glorious, amazing leap of imagination. I'd be interested to know if there are any of the the truly greats, Maimonides,
Maimonides,
Plato, anybody who gets us close. Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle's Republic is kind of.
No, that's Plato Republic.
Sorry, Plato's Republic. I thought Plato. Yeah.
And you said Aristotle. Yeah, the thing is interesting. I was on that, let's say 12th, 13th, 14th century. Could a peasant imagine themselves say, well, suppose I wasn't a peasant. Suppose I wasn't.
I imagine they thought about that a lot.
A lot, right.
Okay.
But then what you do...
What did Tevye say? If I were a rich man...
Yeah, imagine that I'm not a peasant. Yeah, then I can eat all day whatever I want.
Yeah,
I don't have
I'd
to
have a
work.
big,
Okay.
tall house with
Right.
rooms by the dozen. Yeah.
Everybody, other peasants will do all the stuff I have to do all day.
Other peasants will do the stuff instead of me.
Yeah,
That's it.
Right.
Right.
But now, did such imagination led to the question, oh, wait a minute, well, what kind of society would that be?
Mm-hmm. Well,
Because there must be stories about that.
Well, some of the great thinkers, Jesus, Muhammad were great, and Moses, these are great thinkers in a way about they're imagining new ways of putting society together.
Right. But
part of what happened historically, that imagination has evolved. Again, I think started in the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
The loosening, to put it very simply, the loosening of political structures in Italy, the splitting of Italy into small princehoods, enabled a larger degree of social mobility than ever was possible, and enabled the beginning of that kind of imagination. And you can ask, if you think about that, you can ask, what is this about social mobility? Social mobility is a very great threat to conservative religious ideology.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Because it entails openness to change in values and change in commitments.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. By the way, I have to mention this because it's very important. This is why.
Wait a minute. It doesn't. It implies.
Think about it.
Okay, go on, Peter.
The story of Moses in the very book that they cherish and blah blah blah. It's all about social mobility. Mm-hmm. Moses was basically the son of slaves that became the second most powerful person in Egypt. What more social mobility you want? And then led the whole bunch of slaves out and made a nation. So it's right there. Mm-hmm. If you can pay attention to it, and you have the conceptual frame to identify what is really in the story.
Right, and this gets repeated many times, of course, where the religion celebrates the rupture and then says, "And don't do it again." On that note, I wondered if we could, what do you think about taking a break?
Yeah, I need to take a break to go out and sing.
Okay. Now, should we call it a day for our live stream, or maybe it's time because we've been at this?
I don't know. Pini wants to say a lot of things, so I think that
I maybe before we call it a day, one quick comment about, again, to comment on something that one of you said. One of you, Peter, right, mentioned fascism and the rise of fascism. So I want to mention a little book that I really like called Escape from Freedom by Erich Fromm, which is in part a history and explanation of the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany and Italy. And part of the idea is, and we all alluded to this in one way or another, is that autonomy is a burden. Mm-hmm. It puts responsibility on the individual to make decisions, to choose a path in life, and so on. And that burden is a burden. It can be difficult. Mm-hmm. And there are systems out there like conservative, and I want to emphasize conservative, not all religion, but very conservative religion, which is very authoritarian, and also other alternatives, other systems like fascism, which offer an escape from freedom. And that can be very tempting. And that's a great danger for societies historically, in 20th century, before, maybe the 19th century, 20th century, and certainly these days continues to be a threat.
Yes, yeah. And I agree. And I think there is a huge topic there that that a channel from what you just said and what we discussed to the whole other thing is that when you are not organizing yourself or your society, whatever level it is, according to a baked-in hierarchical structure, then a lot of fluidities come into place. And to have the right empirical methods of how to control temporarily those fluidities and organize the dynamics is not easy. And one of the critiques of the emergence of the authoritarian religious conservative current movement is to say our society is out of control, and it's out of control because of this enlightenment conception of autonomy, individual autonomy, and all of that, which is basically doing what you want, and that's why it's out of control. And we need to go back to a hierarchical structure, and so forth and so on. That is a whole.
That's the game. Every time.
That's
our society's out of control, and knowing this, they actually can be nihilists and purposely make the society out of control by, for example, refusing to raise the debt limit.
Right.
Or
well, the whole point is there is a logic behind it. The point is, if we can't bring our hierarchical systems watered down to policies and all that, I don't want to say that this is how they talk. Essentially, through the legislative method, then we burn the whole thing down and rebuild it again.
Yeah.
There's a logic there.
Yes. If your adherence is to the hierarchy and the hierarchical thinking, the hierarchical organization that is what you're fundamentally loyal to, then this game makes sense. And this is exactly what is playing out in the U.S. and many other countries today.
But you have to really take very seriously the idea here is that burning it down in order to rebuild is much better in the long term
from their perspective than letting it deteriorate to the point where you can't rebuild again. Mm-hmm. That's the logic behind the thing, and that's a whole other conversation that we could perhaps at some point engage in. Yeah, perhaps next time. Okay, let's call it. It's been we're 1 hour and 27 minutes into our 1 hour conversation, so maybe this is a good time to call it a day.
Time is relative.
Yeah.
For me, it was merely 52 seconds.
To you, minutes. It was fast.
52 minutes only.
Okay, so let's say thank you.
Thank you all.
To Pini and Peter and assistant co-host Argus, wherever he may be. And great talk. I think may have a good. We'll decide. But we may have a good topic for next week, which is to articulate a little more, bring this more to the current situation, and understand more what are the political implications and the political stakes about religious freedom, about authoritarianism of this discussion we've been having today about the concept of autonomy. Thanks again. We shall see everybody next week.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.